Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I have accepted the invitation to moderate this session with great pleasure. The session is about environmental issues, climate change, let's say, and populism. And I think I have been invited to moderate this session since my main research interests are focusing exactly on populism, right-wing and left-wing populism, extreme right and radical right political parties and movement. In particular, I am currently conducting two research projects, European Horizon research project on these topics. One is Autlib, New Authoritarianism in Europe, in which I focus on the transnationalization of right-wing populism, ideas, frames, networks on many salient issues, among which climate change. And the other project is the CIDAPE project, which is focusing on the politics of emotions. So I'm focusing on the intervening variable of political emotions, exactly in the nexus between right-wing populism in Europe as well, and socio-economic disequalities and climate change ecological transition. So today it's a really a great pleasure to listen to John Meyer and also to have the occasion to discuss his presentation. John Meyer is professor in the Department of Politics at Cal Poly Humboldt of California North Coast. He also is part of the interdisciplinary programs on environmental studies and environment and community. As a political scientist, his work is extremely helpful, I would say, inspiring for us in understanding how social and political values and institutions shape our relationship with environment. So the list of publication and books is huge, so I cannot mention them. Just to stress here that Professor John Meyer has been also awarded of many prizes for his publication concerning environmental social action, let's say, social criticism and the resonance dilemma, MIT 2015, and the Oxford Handbook on Environmental Political Theory, Oxford 2016. So I close here my let's say, little introduction comparing to the prestigious of the speaker we are going to listen to now. Thank you, everybody, and the floor is yours, Professor Meyer.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kayani, and welcome to all of you. I understand this is your first day of the summer school session. It's great to see so many folks here today. I will just go ahead and begin by sharing my screen and sharing my presentation, and then I think I'll get right into it. So let's do that first. So let's see. Okay. I seem to have lost the ability to see all of you, but if somebody can just confirm that my screen is visible to all of you, I'll go ahead and begin.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, great, wonderful, thank you. Again, the title for my talk is you may have seen before is Climate Justice and Populism, Friends or Foes. I really, I guess, have three fundamental points that I want to cover with you in the next 40 minutes or so. I want to emphasize at the outset that this is really intended as a conceptual approach to thinking about populism as it relates to climate politics and climate justice in particular. I'm not here to share any particular empirical findings from research, but to encourage us to think perhaps in a different way about the relationship of climate and populism than the way we often do. So three basic themes, as I said at the outset. The first and perhaps the most familiar will be a focus on the authoritarian populism ascendant in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere as a threat to climate justice in particular and climate politics in general. The second theme is an argument that, in effect, mainstream climate action is manifest as a form of anti-populism, and I'll say more about what I mean by that. And then third, perhaps most relevantly to the title of my talk, I'll talk about climate justice as a manifestation of populism or populist discourse. So those are the three basic themes that I want to cover with you. I'll just start by diving into the first of these, which is, as I say, is probably the one it is the one I'll spend the least time on because it's probably the most familiar to many of you. I should say, just skipping back, climate justice as populism, I want to emphasize both the inclusive conception of a notion of the people, horizontal solidarity within movements, and engagement with everyday material concerns. So I'll say more about all that as I get to that third theme in my talk this morning. So again, jumping back to the first of these, authoritarian populism as a threat. I want to give an overview of some relevant characteristics of this familiar understanding of populism as it relates to climate change in general. Nothing in the remainder of my talk should be interpreted as in any way minimizing these grave threats. Though, as I've already indicated, I will argue that populism itself is not the source of the problem and can also be integral to a strategy for change. So what do I mean by authoritarian populism as a threat? First, of course, is that it's manifest by a great many right-wing and arguably fascistic parties. Sorry? I'll just continue unless there's something that I need to correct on my end. Right-wing and fascistic parties and leaders, populism in an authoritarian vein is a threat to climate policy as an elite and global project. That's often the way it's cast in authoritarian populism, and I think there's some resonance there that we have to grapple with. Authoritarian populists often attack climate policy, criticize climate policy in the name of or in the interests of some notion of the people, which is typically presented in a very homogeneous and homogenizing way. And as many scholars of populism have noted, that homogenizing way often excludes at least as many people as it includes. And next, of course, is that authoritarian populism often differentiates, right? So we could talk about environmental concerns more generally, but also about climate change, climate crisis in particular. And it's the case that at least in some places and some movements and leaders, that authoritarian or right-wing populists distinguish between local and national forms of environmental protection on the one hand, and global climate change on the other. Excuse me for just a minute. With respect to the local and national environmental protection, perhaps especially around land in rural communities, but also around waterways, air pollution, and so forth, at least some right-wing populists will argue for the protection of the homeland, of rural communities, of quote unquote, our national space. But then at the same time as they're doing that, at least in some cases, attacking especially programs for and policies for change in addressing global climate change. The last point really about this authoritarian threat of populism is that these leaders, these parties, these movements typically deny or are skeptical of climate change and in that way politicize the climate change debate and are often criticized for politicizing it in that way. And I'll say more about this notion of denialism and skepticism and the different ways it manifests in a little bit later in my talk. My apologies, it's first thing in the morning here. I seem to be a little bit hoarse, so I'm going to take a few moments to just sip my tea here as I go through my talk. But this is, again, the first basic theme. I want to recognize that. I want us to be aware of that kind of threat in the background, because much of the rest of my talk, I'm going to be describing different phenomenon. So if we turn next to the mainstream of climate action itself, and here I'm thinking about the UNFCCC process, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and their annual COP meetings, the Conference of Parties. As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, the next one will be taking place, the COP 30, the 30th annual meeting of parties, take place in Belém, Brazil, this coming November. But also mainstream climate action as it's manifest in many regional and national policies in the EU and many countries throughout North America, Europe, and really across the rest of the globe. Certainly not, we can't generalize about all of those, but I think there is a way in which we can talk about the mainstream, the dominant approach to policymaking on climate in these areas. And I think it's fair to describe that, as I will explain, as a form of anti-populism. So here I'm thinking particularly about establishment parties, mainstream parties and leaders, about what sometimes is called legacy media sources, dominant news sites, broadcast television, large environmental NGOs at both the international and global north levels. These are, I think, appropriately and understandably often cast as elites, political, economic, and social elites. That, of course, plays into a certain kind of populist narrative and binary. I think this kind of mainstream climate action, as I'll explain more in a minute, reflects a certain kind of mainstream political imaginary that I suggest may be a product, at least in part, of nostalgia. That mainstream imaginary about how politics used to be, how politics should be once again, but is not now, is one that emphasizes the value and the centrality of civility, of pluralism, of respect for science, and a sort of globalist ethic that, and here I'm quoting from a passage by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres a couple of years ago, where he said, in appealing to nation states for more effective climate action, he said, we're all in this together, right? And I think although Guterres has been a particularly strong voice on climate policy, I think this mainstream political imaginary characterized by these values of civility, of pluralism, of respect for science and globalism have dominated the climate space and the climate policy space. And of course, it's understandable that that space is therefore one that rejects climate skepticism and rejects what we described, or what I described a moment ago, as the populists' politicization of the climate change debate. So those are some characteristics, I think, of mainstream climate action as populism. Next, what I want to do is just turn to some of the kinds of policies themselves that are presented in this anti-populist mainstream framework. Here, I would emphasize, and this is familiar to those of you who have studied environmental and climate policy, that mainstream policy approaches tend to be very technocratic, emphasis on technological innovation, emphasis on the development of carbon capture technologies, for example, on efficiencies and so forth. It tends to be technocratic in those ways. And as I think is sort of self-evident when we think about the UNFCCC process, it tends to be a sort of top-down form of policymaking. For the past generation, really more than a generation now, at least the last 25 or 30 years, the dominant political policy, or the dominant policy strategy for climate policy has been to focus on carbon pricing, both through cap and trade policies and also through carbon taxation. The idea is that if we raise the price of carbon, we reshape the economy as a result, and that this will have the effect of reducing emissions and therefore addressing, mitigating climate impacts. More recently, both in the United States in the form in 2022 of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which was primarily climate policy despite the name, and in the so-called European Green Deal, we've seen a move, at least in small steps, towards something that moved away from just carbon pricing and towards something like an industrial policy. Still here, and I'll just speak about the Inflation Reduction Act here, the focus has been on economic incentive-based funding and on collaboration between government and private sector industries to incentivize particular corporations, particular industries to develop renewable technologies and so forth. In the United States in particular, and we see this now with Trump's policy to eviscerate the policies of the Inflation Reduction Act, we see that the policies that were developed under that law over the last couple of years from 2022 to 2024 were largely politically invisible, even to those who benefited. That is, even those who were employed by industries that were receiving subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act, who were engaged in jobs that benefited from that, typically in what we here in the United States call red states, right? Largely Republican leaning regions, often were not aware, not because of their own blindness, but because the policy was developed in a way that wasn't very explicit, wasn't very visible in the way that it made it clear where the benefits were coming from and what the benefits were designed to do. So the political invisibility of the policy actually, I think, in many ways, made it much easier for Trump and his supporters to undermine and ultimately eviscerate that policy, especially in the new law that was passed by Congress this past week in the United States. I'm less deeply familiar with the specifics of the European Green Deal, but from what I have seen, some of these same characteristics are evident in that policy. And I think it's clear to say that the European Green Deal is an example of the sort of mainstream policy approach to climate policy in recent years. So a little bit of a move away from carbon pricing, but still some of the same characteristics. I want to just offer a few brief news items that I think illustrate this mainstream political imaginary, this anti-populist imaginary about climate policy. This first one is written by a political scientist in the blog of the European Consortium for Political Research. It's about, I think, about a year and a half old, but here he says, as the climate crisis begins to wreak tangible damage on human lives, mainstream political actors have become even more crucial. Their efforts must not only compensate for decades of inaction, they must also confront the growing populist opposition. So the approach here is to emphasize the ways in which, while we want to acknowledge, in this framework, we want to acknowledge that climate policy has been deeply inadequate up to this point, right? The COP30 meetings make it clear that we've been trying this for 30 years and haven't had a tremendous amount of success. But at the same time as acknowledging that inadequacy, there's this sort of doubling down on mainstream political actors as becoming, as it says here, even more crucial. Tony Blair, former UK Prime Minister, of course, has been very outspoken in recent months on just this theme. Blair created the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, and the Institute has really focused on trying to oppose populist initiatives throughout Europe and throughout the UK and Europe more generally. This report, The Climate Paradox, is one that the Institute and Blair in particular released a few months ago, back at the end of April of this year. And you can see here, I've just pulled a quote again from this. This new report is certainly critical of some mainstream policy on climate, and it's been critiqued for that, but primarily on the grounds that it's not anti-populist enough. So we see here, Blair's report says that the failure to deliver by mainstream political actors has created an opening for populists who exploit public skepticism and frame climate action as an elite-driven agenda. The result, political will is receding just as climate accelerates. I think that first passage, that first quote, probably wouldn't engender much critique from almost anybody on the political spectrum. But then he goes on to say, the debate needs to be taken out of the hands of campaigners and put in the hands of policymakers. I just encourage you to pause for a moment and think about what that might mean. What does it mean for the political debate about climate to be taken out of the hands of campaigners? How does one do that and put it in the hands of policymakers? He goes on to argue, the report goes on to argue that a realistic voice on the climate debate is required, neither ideological nor alarmist, but pragmatic, solutions-driven, and outcome-oriented. So again, there seems to be here a doubling down on something like the mainstream political imaginary, and it's very explicitly here framed as anti-populist. I think it's fair to say that the framework about taken out of the hands of campaigners and put in the hands of policymakers, the policymakers are the mainstream for sure. And finally, I'll offer one further example of this from a report by two political scientists, Eduardo Campanella and Robert Lawrence. Campanella and Lawrence offer a somewhat more nuanced account of the mainstream approach to climate policy. They focus this article in Foreign Affairs on the need for better storytelling by advocates of climate policy. But notice here, as I'll read you the quote, notice that the underlying story they focus on, a story focused on trade, innovation, and so-called entrepreneurial genius, is fundamentally the same. So Campanella and Lawrence argue that proponents of climate policy should not leave playing on people's emotions to the populist right. Instead, they should tell compelling and energizing stories about the consequences of climate inaction. They should emphasize that the most radical solutions will not come from government, but from entrepreneurial genius in its purest form. In some, more open trade in the short run, more innovation in the long run are needed to reduce the costs of the green transition. So again, I think all three of these examples capture something about this mainstream political imaginary and its anti-populist focus, its motivation to respond to the authoritarian populism of the right that's so critical of climate policy is, I think, apparent in each of these passages. I want to argue that anti-populism is, in a sense, a trap for climate politics. It's a trap because, first of all, it reinforces what I will describe here as the populist binary, familiar from many, many scholars of populism, who argue that its key characteristic is some sort of clear opposition between the people on the one hand and elites on the other. This mainstream anti-populism reinforces that populist binary and by, in a sense, reversing it. It has the effect of defending elites and the establishment, which is rarely a popular political position. Elite policy intentions, as we saw in each of the examples I just provided, is presented as the solution in a very explicit manner. And perhaps somewhat more implicitly, the implication is that the people, the passions of the moment, the populists who tap into and manipulate the passions of the people are presented as the problem. Politics, from this anti-populist perspective, I want to argue, reinforces a notion of necessity, politics of necessity, rather than volition. And here I'm borrowing from a framework offered by Jonathan White of the London School of Economics. I provided a link to his article in my materials for this morning. And White is the one who distinguishes this politics of necessity from volition, arguing that one of the effective strategies that populists on the right and the left have used is rejecting the notion of a politics of necessity, which conveys to the population that they have no meaningful choice, that policies are obligatory in the context of climate policy because science, it's argued, offers a clear guide to action, and politicization of policy is understood as a danger, right? So these are, I think, the central sort of frameworks that lead White, and I think he's right, to conclude that climate policy often is presented by the mainstream as a politics of necessity rather than of choice or volition. And I want to suggest, as he does, that anti-populism therefore becomes a trap. Some other ways in which this happens, I think, is that anti-populism fails to address the disproportionate impacts, the injustices of climate change itself, right? In many cases, right, whether we're talking about the disproportionate impacts on small island nations or on impoverished communities in the global north, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately on the poor, the marginalized, the minoritized across the globe. It is also the case, and this is something that I'll get into more when we turn to climate justice policy, it is also the case that climate policies from this mainstream anti-populist perspective themselves often provide disproportionate impacts on poorer and more minoritized communities in the global north and the south. They often rest the burden more heavily on those who are least responsible and those with the fewest resources to adapt. So these, of course, as I highlight here, are all reflections of arguments about justice and injustice, which is central to the climate justice movements that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. One more set of characteristics here. Anti-populism becomes a trap for climate politics, I argue, because it wrongly characterizes populism as not incidentally, but inherently always, whether on the right or the left, as exclusionary, as skeptical of climate knowledge, climate change knowledge, and as an existential threat to climate action. So these are all a set of reasons why I think that the sort of mainstream political framework for addressing climate policy has become, in some senses, a self-reinforcing trap that undermines the political ability to get climate policy adopted and supported by populations across the global north, but also the global south. Now, I've mentioned a couple times arguments about skepticism and denialism of climate change knowledge. And so I want to take just a brief interlude here to talk about different varieties of climate skepticism. And here I'm drawing on an article from some years ago, about 10 years ago, by von Rensburg that offers this particular diagram. I think it's fair to say that authoritarian populists and other radical right parties are often identified with what, in von Rensburg's terms, is described as evidence skepticism, right? Skeptical of the evidence of the scientific evidence of climate change's existence. And that becomes manifest in a few different ways as skepticism or denial of the trends towards greater and greater global warming and climate disruption. Skepticism about the cause, the anthropogenic or human causes of climate change, and skepticism about the impact. So here we might get arguments about even if climate change trends are occurring, that these might open up new possibilities for longer growing seasons in the far north of the northern hemisphere, the far south of the southern hemisphere, and so forth. These arguments have been around for a long time. They've been especially familiar and influential, I think, in the United States for a very long time. They're perhaps growing in some ways in Europe, at least in some groups. Um, but I think there's an increasing recognition that not all forms of climate skepticism are manifest as skepticism of the scientific evidence. And so here I just want to kind of highlight, as von Rensburg does, the set of concomitant arguments about process and about response. As we'll see, these focuses on process and response raise some important connections because climate justice movements themselves, while not critical of the evidence and existence of climate change, are often quite critical of the processes by which scientific knowledge about climate is generated and what's excluded from that process. They're often quite critical about who is excluded from climate decision-making processes, and they're quite critical about the policy instruments and policy style that are used in the development and deployment of climate policy. We'll come back to this, but I just want to highlight here from the beginning or from early on this distinction between being skeptical of the scientific evidence and being skeptical of the process and response by which policy is developed. I think it's fair to say that at least some right-wing and authoritarian populist movements in Europe and elsewhere have increasingly moved into criticism of these concomitant forms of skepticism, certainly not universally or consistently, but that puts them in the same camp as I've suggested some climate justice movements, although of course their arguments are very, very different. Okay, so let's turn then to what I want to really focus on for the remainder of my time, which is climate justice as, in a sense, a manifestation of a form of populism. And here I want to emphasize from the beginning that there are a diverse array of climate justice movements, particularly, but certainly not solely, emergent from the global south and from marginalized communities in the north, from youth-based movements and others. This is not an empirical talk where I'm going to be describing in great detail what those movements are or their structures or interconnections. But I do want to emphasize from the beginning that climate justice and climate justice movements cannot be understood as synonymous with climate policy more generally. And climate justice cannot be, or at least should not be understood as an add-on to climate policy. That is, I think it's a huge mistake when policymakers, politicians, NGOs, and others assume that, say, climate policy can be developed through a certain carbon pricing mechanism, but then once that's implemented and deployed, we might be able to reroute some of the funding from that, the carbon tax or pricing towards benefiting minoritized, marginalized communities as a sort of additional way of compensating for some of the distributional effects of the climate policy that harms those who have the fewest resources the most. That sort of add-on approach is not what climate justice movements themselves focus on. The movements focus, and here I'm going to lay out several characteristics that I want to say a little bit more about in the coming slides. The movements focus on an inclusive definition of the people, a rejection of what climate justice activists and organizers call false solutions and elite foot dragging, rely on a distinction of expertise from political, social, and economic elites, an engagement with people where they're at now, that is based on the concerns that they have in their everyday lives, rather than an appeal to them to overcome those concerns in order to focus on climate. This is something I've written about at length. And finally, on building cooperative and governmental structures that can sustain this kind of work and can sustain a commitment to climate justice over the long run. And so I'll say a bit about each of these characteristics of climate justice as populism in turn, starting with the inclusive definition of the people. Many populist scholars And here I'm thinking, for example, you might be familiar with the work of Nadia Urbanati, who has written important and valuable work on the framework of populist parties and leaders. Urbanati in particular, but many others as well, focus almost exclusively on parties and political leaders who are striving to become ruling parties and powers. And Urbanati and others often, certainly not always, but often explicitly dismiss social movements that exhibit certain populist arguments and frameworks as, quote, not unusual. That quote is from Urbanati's work, and therefore uninteresting to populist scholars. By contrast, I want to argue that some of the most powerful and some of the most distinctive aspects about populism are visible in movements like the ones that are manifest on this slide. These are, in a sense, the essence, I would argue, of climate justice movements today, right? Here we see in the upper left a screenshot from the Climate Justice Now movement that's organizing in Brazil in advance of the COP30 meetings. We see their argument that they're going to organize a people summit in contrast to the existing official summit. The people summit is our strength, our cry for climate justice. And we see above here, real change comes from those who live the reality, from those who know the land, the territory, and the collective pulse of the future. And of course, this language of the people, so central to all kinds of populist frameworks, is repeated time and time again in the climate justice movement, as we see in these various images. The binary between the people and the elites, it's a little harder to see, but in this photograph here, which side are you on? The contrast here between people and polluters, people and elites effectively is central. Here we see climate justice affects us the most, an emphasis on what are sometimes in the climate justice space called frontline and fence line communities, those that are most impacted and closest to the consequences of destructive policies and problems. So all these, I think, are reflections of an inclusive definition of the people rather than the exclusive definitions that are so familiar in authoritarian and right-wing populists. The rejection of so-called false solutions, this language of false solutions is repeated quite frequently in the literature. And so we see here an organization of Catholic bishops calling for climate justice and rejecting, quote, false solutions that put profit over the common good. A report here on resisting false solutions to climate change put out by a network of climate justice organizers. And perhaps most famously, several years ago, Greta Thunberg of Fridays for Future, in describing what I'm here terming elite foot dragging, sort of captivated the international media by referring to the promises being made at the COP meetings at that time as blah, 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 nothing more than words. This emphasis on rejecting false solutions that sound good in theory but aren't actually implemented in a way that is equitable for all is absolutely central to the climate justice movement. A distinction of expertise from elites is often manifest as a focus on indigenous and local and traditional forms of knowledge. This is particularly true with relation to climate adaptation, right? That local forms of knowledge embedded within communities rather than scientists coming in from the outside are often best positioned to understand how communities can adapt and thrive in the face of climate change. So again, the point is not necessarily to draw a distinction and say that, for lack of a better term, standard forms of science and traditional forms of knowledge are at odds with each other, but that standard forms of science typically in the past have excluded traditional and local knowledges that climate justice activists and organizers seek to elevate and make central. And finally, and I'll put this as one slide here. Finally, the environmental justice or climate justice focus on engaging people where they're at now and on building cooperative structures is absolutely central. And here, I want to just share a brief video clip from a talk by Naomi Klein, who some of you may be familiar with. It was delivered a couple months ago in May of this year. The title of her talk, as you see here, is Fascism or Eco-Populism, Our Stark Choice. Klein spent much of her talk, and I'm just going to share about a 2-minute clip from it here and then wrap up my points here. Klein spent much of her talk addressing the aftermath of a particularly destructive wildfire known as the 2018 Camp Fire that destroyed a community very close to where I live here in Northern California, the community of Paradise, California, perhaps ironically named. It was then the deadliest and is still the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history. 85 people died, but more than 18,000 structures, including about 10,000 homes, were destroyed. And over 30,000 people were left homeless as a result of this fire. The nearest city, it's not a terribly big city, but the nearest city is Chico, California, a few miles away, with a population of about 100,000. And what Naomi Klein does in her talk here, and what she describes, is the ways in which the fire refugees were at first welcomed in the town of Chico, right? A city of 100,000 welcoming roughly 30,000 new residents, right? And you see in the background, and unfortunately, the video of her talk, the audio is clear, the video is kind of dark because of the nature of the auditorium she was speaking in. But you see on the left-hand side here, from early on in the days after these refugees arrived in Chico, one of those refugees describing a, quote, blanket of love and comfort that was provided to these refugees from what I think is fair to say is a massive climate disaster. But Chico had little housing or room in schools or medical facilities or other spaces necessary to accommodate so many refugees. And over time, there was a backlash in the city, reflected in the second slide behind Klein, which describes the election of new, much more conservative officials. And you can't really see it well here, but it says a crackdown on homelessness in the town of Chico, in the city of Chico. That backlash, I think, is especially notable. It's certainly familiar to many of us in other contexts, but it's especially notable here because these refugees, these fire refugees, these climate refugees, were not from a different country or culture or race, but from a neighboring community. Naomi Klein argues that this is an example, this shift from the blanket of love and comfort to a crackdown is an example of something she terms in this talk a fascist flip from welcoming to rejecting. And in the clip that I'm going to share with you from her talk, she argues that only eco-populism offers an approach that can prevent that sort of fascist flip. So let me share the clip with you now. And we'll take it from there.
So I want organizing rooted in realism. Organizing that asks the question, how do we sustain solidarity beyond the effervescent uprising? How do we build stamina for our movements of transformation? What kind of infrastructure does that demand? What shared values does it require? Because a shocking event or image can open our hearts to one another for a brief time, and we've all seen and felt that. But if we want to keep our hearts open for the long haul, that requires public policy transformation. Transformation that helps us feel safe, cared for, and respected on a fundamental level. And that's what those Chico activists and local politicians were valiantly attempting to do when they proposed a Green New Deal framework for their city. An eco-populist approach that would have helped the entire community, lifting the floor up for everyone, and not forced residents to choose between caring about their own economic needs and caring about their neighbors. And after receiving some initial support, their plan, like the National Green New Deal under Biden, was marginalized and sidelined and ultimately defeated. And that defeat has consequences, as all of our defeats do. But thankfully, we get back up again. I've been thinking and watching closely Zohran Mamdani's campaign for mayor in New York City. It's really, he's doing a new kind of politics, and it's worth paying close attention to. He represents a part of Queens with the largest public housing project in the country. And a great many of the people who live there, most of them black and brown, voted for Trump. And instead of dismissing them or condescending to them, in the days after the election, Mamdani went out and talked to them. And he heard stories like, my elevator's been broken for more than a year, and an immigrant down the street is living in a nice hotel and was given a debit card. And from this, he did not conclude that the left has to stop supporting migrants, as some people have. He concluded that the left needs to do a better job of fighting for everyone, a much better job of raising the floor on the basics for everyone. He concluded that the kind of politics that has the best chance of stopping the fascist flip is the politics of universalism. So he's running on rent freezes, on free and fast buses, a climate solution, municipally owned grocery stores with price caps, politics that say every single one of us has a right to food, housing, transportation, and care for our bodies and minds.
Okay. Let me just say in response or in following up, I think again that Klein's talk there, or the comments that I excerpted from it, make it clear that to engage people where they're at now is central to an eco-populist approach, and that without structures in place, I've said cooperative structures here, she tends to focus more on governmental ones, but without those structures in place, our compassion, our care for each other can't be sustained in the long run, but with them in place, it might be. No promises, but possibilities. And so in sum, climate justice as populism is an approach that centers the differential effects upon the people, that familiar populist category, upon their livelihood, their practices of care, as Klein talked about here, their connections with the places where they live and work and play. Climate justice as populism does politicize climate, but it politicizes the processes and responses, the knowledge, which is often rooted in counter forms of expertise and rejects top-down policymaking. Climate justice as populism proposes policies and structures that respect people's everyday concerns, that reinforce solidarity, and build future support. I want to reiterate, as I just said a moment ago, that none of this is to offer political guarantees or assurances, but is to open up new possibilities for the ways we think about populism, new possibilities for the ways we think about climate, and new possibilities for the ways we think about justice. So with that, let me end and welcome your comments, your suggestions. I've listed my email address and my web address here. If you'd like to follow up with me, I'm more than happy to do so. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.